Welcome back to World War II TV as we kick off our Salerno series 80 years on. And joining me today is author Todd DePastino. Todd is part of the amazing Veterans Breakfast Club, which he might talk about in a minute, and combines history, cartoons, and all other aspects of kind of culture in his work. And I will hold up a copy of his book, which is the subject of today's show. There are links to purchase it in the description below. And by the way, that was a bit of Mozart because it was copyright free. Didn't have to pay anybody for it. So first time I've used Mozart on World War II TV. I'm going somewhere in the world. But I'm going to bring in Todd now. So good afternoon, Todd. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. So I love people who are new to the channel who have fingers in more than one pie, so to speak, to kind of talk about how they would define themselves, because you've written books and you can tell us about the Veterans Breakfast Club. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I was once a professional historian, meaning I wrote and taught history at the college level. And I now don't do that any longer. I still give lectures, public lectures, but I direct a nonprofit organization called the Veterans Breakfast Club that gets veterans together online and in person to share their stories. I still do a little bit of writing. We publish a quarterly magazine, and we're going to publish some manuscripts as books. But the interesting thing for this context is the Veterans Breakfast Club, for me, was really born from the biography of Bill Mauldin. I mean, not only did the book kind of teach me a lot and build my writing the book, build up my knowledge, but it actually changed my life.
No, absolutely. And this is going to be one of the things we're going to be talking about. You come with a presentation, but for people under 50 or 60, a cartoonist in World War II, there's no frame of reference. But back in the war, he had global reach, not instantaneously like we do today, where your TikToks and your videos come in a minute, but in terms of how far his cartoons traveled and who read them and who was annoyed by them and loved them. I love the fact that General Patton, and we've talked about Patton numerous times in this channel, called him an unpatriotic anarchist, which that means you've been noticed. I mean, there's one of the things we talked about, and I will shut up and let you bring your presentation on, is that in World War II, correspondents were part of the war effort. They were very much selling the story of the war along government lines. It wasn't like recent years where people out there trying to find scandals and what have you in modern wars. But Bill, as we will get to, was completely okay with showing the misery of army life, that perhaps the food was a bit shit and the clothing didn't keep them waterproof. And those are the kind of things that when you're trying to wage a war, they may not go down well in all quarters. And we can get into that later on. So I feel honesty was at the core of what he was doing.
Yeah, he was a wartime celebrity. He really was. I mean, but he went overseas as a completely anonymous three-stripe sergeant, 20 years old, came back a millionaire and a celebrity, and it was all because of the cartoons.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you've come on with a PowerPoint, and you're in charge of it. And folks, I think it's going to be one of those conversations that's going to go in several directions, which are the ones we like the most. So fire away with questions and comments. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Todd to kind of take us through this extraordinary gentleman's life. And particularly, the focus is how much his writing about the Italy campaign, because that is the subject of this series, influenced, everything. The public were getting their idea about how it was going there. And the Italian campaign was a slog. There were bits of it that were mismanaged. Why did they land that division land there without that unit there? Why did they go from this direction up there? Why spend days banging your head against this defensive line when you could have gone around this way? So he was there to kind of report all that, particularly with the 45th Infantry. But I'll hand it over to you, and I'll sit back and learn a lot.
Mauldin is still the youngest Pulitzer Prize winner in history at age 23. He was once a household name. He is not anymore. And I'm not too ashamed to say that I really hadn't heard of Mauldin until I started, really about a year before I started working on his biography. I was aware of Mauldin only in that he appeared every year in Peanuts. And Charles Schulz every year for Veterans Day, Charles Schulz would put Snoopy in his World War II garrison cap or his World War I flying ace outfit even. And Snoopy would always go and quaff a few root beers with Bill Mauldin. 1998, Schulz did his last Mauldin tribute. And by the way, Schulz would always sign and send it to Mauldin, the original drawing. And Mauldin had a bad habit. He had many bad habits, but one of them was not opening his mail. So he would throw fan mail into an empty room, and there it would stack. So he didn't know for many years that Schultz was sending him this. Schultz did 10,000 cartoons over a 50-year career. This is the only one that has others' work appearing in it. It's Willie and Joe, Mauldin's great dog-faced characters walking down a muddy street, a blasted battlescape. I think the new replacements are getting smaller all the time. And Snoopy says, Willie and Joe, my heroes. Happy Veterans Day, men. Schultz was a machine gun squad leader in France and Germany in World War II. And he was an aspiring cartoonist himself. So he worshipped Mauldin his whole life. Schultz always said that Bill Mauldin was the greatest cartoonist who ever lived, and there never would be anybody better. But the name Bill Mauldin was really only something that Snoopy uttered to me until I opened up this book, and I kind of picked it up. It's an easy read. I read it cover to cover, 32,000 words, 162 cartoons. It spent 19 weeks on the New York Times, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list in 1945. It was a sensation when it came out, this book. And it was stunning to me. The words and the pictures were stunning to me. I'd never seen anything quite like it. It was a vision of war and a vision of combat and a vision of the army that seemed to defy, or at least go against, the dominant strain of the American visual culture of World War II, which was, Bond posters and Hollywood and magazines where our fighting men were always brave, morale was always high. The men were always clean cut. They were always gung-ho, ready to fight.
Well, it's funny because James Holland, the renowned historian who I was with this weekend, he always, when he's doing a little talk about the British Americans, he says, and they're the Americans with their perfect teeth and their broad shoulders and their blonde hair. And that is kind of the image we have, whereas Bill turns that on its head. Willie, people might know the cartoons, or I'm sure as a young man, I knew the cartoons before I knew who penned them and drew them. And those images, it weren't the images that we get in the war films, the Errol Flynn American war films. Everybody was impossibly handsome.
Yeah, impossibly handsome. I mean, look at these images here, and then look at this. How much more interesting this is. Yeah. How much more absorbing this is. That men aren't charging into fire when they're fired upon. They're putting themselves as they're pressing themselves into the earth as deeply as they can. The caption is, "I can't get no lower, Willie. My buttons are in the way." These guys are, and then imagine being covered in mud once you stand up. I had no idea. It was really Mauldin's cartoons that brought home to me the reality, not only of the danger, but of the discomfort of war, the indignities of war. Wished I could stand up and get some sleep. The exhaustion of war. That serving in war it means deprivation on many levels. I really didn't understand the kind of caste difference between officers and enlisted men in World War II. That would improve certainly after the war, and thanks in small part, I think, to Mauldin's work. Beautiful View. Is there one for the enlisted men? And then, this kind of sardonic attitude towards things like medals and ribbons and awards and all those things that service members rightly take great pride in long after the war, it seems. During the war, those things don't seem so much. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a young vet who came home from Afghanistan with a Silver Star, and I must have expressed that I was greatly impressed with that. And he looked at me and said, this is not something that you want to get. Yeah. This is you have to experience something really awful to receive something like this. And that goes for the Purple Heart. Just give me the aspirin. Already got a Purple Heart. This cartoon, I read up front in one sitting and I probably understood maybe 1/5 of it. I didn't understand. I was captivated by it without understanding it. And that's a perfect recipe for an author who wants to dig into a subject, because they want to discover more. They want to kind of get to the key. And, this cartoon reminds me of there was humor to the cartoon, certainly, and the humor was fresh and grim, dark, sardonic. But there was also a sweetness and a tragedy. There was a sense of, young lives being cut short, and the sense of being able to bring the whole tragedy and catastrophe that was World War II down to a single frame. here's Joe looking at his M1 Garand. I've given you the best years of my life. And I thought about this cartoon as I was kind of sitting in for a second reading of the book, because it just so happened that at the time Mauldin was dying. He was in a nursing home. He had been an alcoholic. He had burned him. So he had Alzheimer's. He had burned himself. Horrible accident. Didn't speak. Didn't seem to know anybody. Even recognize his family. And a World War II veteran learned that Mauldin was ailing. Came in to visit him. Shared some memorabilia and some cartoons with Mauldin, and then pinned this combat infantry badge on Mauldin's pajamas in the nursing home in Orange County. And Jay Grunfeld, this veteran, I got to know him well later, said, Bill, would you want me to come back? And Bill looked up with a big grin, and he looked down at the CIB, and he said, yes. And that was the first word that Mauldin had uttered in months. And clearly he was recognizing veterans. He was connecting to his Army past. And so Jay Grunfeld went out and gave talks at American Legions and VFWs, encouraging World War II veterans. If you feel like you owe Mauldin something for how he buoyed your spirits in World War II, go pay him a visit, because he could really use it. They lined up 15 to 20 a day. And I know because I interviewed the nursing home administrators, and they said it was crazy. I mean, these vets were coming in with their caps on, with their their memorabilia, their photographs. Some had their uniforms on, and they would stand in the hallway to get 10 minutes with Mauldin. They would go in there, they would hold his hand, and they would talk about their service, and they would say, thank you so much for your cartoons. You told the world what we were going through. Wow.
It reminds me a little bit, although a form of art, of Vera Lynn in Britain. She only passed away a couple of years ago, and she somehow, for the veterans who fought through that war, encapsulated everything about their experience, about the longing to be at home and things like that. And it doesn't, that kind of, it's a one in a million lightning strike. I mean,
that's it.
I've got a couple of compilations of various Marine Corps magazines, and there's British Army ones from the war, and they're full of cartoons. There's good ones, not so good ones, well drawn ones that I just don't get the joke because it was of its time.
Right.
It's not like he was the only one, but there's that magic element that he just appealed. And I've spoken to British veterans who fought in Italy, fought in the war, who appreciate his cartoons, because there's nothing really that comes through about the nationality in it. It's not, the language is maybe a little bit American slang, but not in a way that it would prevent an Australian or a Kiwi from understanding it. And they have exactly the same problem with bad food and bad weather, because Italy, and he wasn't just in Italy, we should state that, but Italy, the weather there didn't make a difference between nationalities. The Germans were under the same shitty weather as the Americans and the Brits and New Zealanders and the French and the Moroccans and everybody else. So that uniting aspect of his cartoons reaching everybody, I think, is something that we'll get to that later on. And that, thank you for sharing that extraordinary story about his last few years.
Yeah, there's something ineffable. There's something that you can't quite describe about how it does capture that reality. And even enemy soldiers, German soldiers, were represented as going. Hans and Fritz, Willie and Joe, they were the same thing. There was a lot of media attention as Mauldin was receiving these vets, and Sam Donaldson and CNN invited people to write to Mauldin, and they did. 10,000 cards and letters came in 3 months, in the last 3 months of Mauldin's life. And so many that this is a picture of Mauldin on the left, his son Nat on the right, reading some of these letters. And Mauldin did seem to be listening. And the family couldn't even open them all. They would send them to me in big boxes. The family eventually would. And I would open these letters and read them. And they were beautiful. These letters, I mean, here's one letter. Can you imagine this? In spidery hand, an older woman saying, "Thank you, Bill. I've always wanted to thank you for how you helped my husband who served in Italy. He would send me your cartoons clipped from Stars and Stripes. We weren't getting them on the home front, but he was sending them to me. I didn't understand them at the time, but over the years, I've gotten to learn what these cartoons meant and what they must have meant to my husband before he was killed in 1944." I mean, can you imagine how kind of intimately connected to this woman's grief, this widow's grief, Mauldin was, and his cartoons were? And that was a stunner to me. And I love this another one that came that I opened had Willie and Joe here in a swampy area in Italy, and Willie says to Joe, "Joe, yesterday you saved my life, and I swore I'd pay you back. Here's my last pair of dry socks." The soldier who sent this, the veteran who sent this to Bill, had said, "Hey, I had trench foot. I saw this cartoon, and you were the only person mentioning the problem of trench foot at the time, and I felt like you were telling the world what we were going through."
Well, it's worth jumping in there because historian hat on now. And yes, folks, it is a new hat. You can find the link to where I got it. I bought it from Stanley Biggs, my friends at We Have Ways. Is that he almost broke the story of trench foot that was rife over the winter of 44, 45 and early, because surprise, surprise, folks, the US Army boot wasn't the best. Most Army boots were never the best, but he kind of broke that to the point, and correct me if I'm wrong, where he's kind of being discussed at kind of a high level as we don't want to let the public know that our people are getting trench foot and have got bad feet, because we're meant to be proving that we've got the P-51 and that this incredible technology, and we've got all these war-winning things. Look how many carriers we've made this week, and yet our guys in the front line, their boots are falling apart. So is that true that he broke that almost?
Yes, I mean he was delivering wake-up calls left and right.
Yeah.
About all the problems taking place in Italy, and it was all bad news. I mean, the wake-up calls all contained bad news, and that's what his cartoons were really about, was the bad news. Mauldin would eventually be buried in the socks that this vet sent to him as a thank you. And he was wonderful, buried on a muddy, rainy, cold day in January 2003. And all this kind of the tribute that Mauldin experienced at the end of his life gives you a sense of like that he was a bearer of grief. He was really an honored, quite an honored person among the veterans community. But the odd thing is he wasn't built for that. He was like this. Look at this picture. He's an imp. There he is in a 10th Mountain Division hat, and
he looks like a cartoon character himself, doesn't he?
He looks like a cartoon,
like one of Peanuts' gang, doesn't he? I mean,
he was. I mean, he was somebody. What he was a troublemaker. There he is on the right is the earliest known photo of Mauldin, drawing already with his left hand with a piece of paper on the ground, but probably about 4 years old. I mean, he remembers his teacher saying, "Mauldin, you're a troublemaker. If you could ever figure out a way to make a living out of it, you'll be a millionaire." He was a troublemaker, a hellraiser. He was also a genius. He was somebody who was able to do long division at age 5. He was reading novels at age 5. He could master any academic task you gave him. But where he came from, which was a remote corner of the desert Southwest in New Mexico, such intellectual prowess wasn't valued. His older brother Sid, 1 year older to the left of him in this photograph, Sid was 6 inches taller than Bill. Sid could take apart a tractor engine blindfolded, by age 12, and nobody cared that Sid couldn't read or write. Sid was considered the successful one of the family. Bill was a runt of the litter. He was small. He was sick. He had rickets. He had some kind of tuberculosis. He had a fiery temper. He said, "I got into more fights on that mountain than any kid, and I lost every one of them." He tells the family story here in one of his books from the 1940s, sort of a saga, which he kind of describes a really traumatic childhood as kind of sweetly eccentric. His father was a hellraiser. His mother was mentally ill. He and his brother ended up leaving home at age, he was 14, his brother was 15. They pulled a Model T out of the family junk pile. They drove it down the mountain in New Mexico, drove it to Phoenix, Arizona, and started a new life. He lived in a boarding house. He played poker on Saturday. He earned money painting signs, never graduated high school. and he ends up joining the 45th Division in 1940 before Pearl Harbor because he needs a new suit of clothes and he needs 3 meals a day. When he joins the Arizona National Guard, it's not yet part of the United States Army, and so he's not given a physical. If he had waited 4 days, he would have been given a physical because it was federalized, made part of the 45th Infantry Division, part of the U.S. Army, and he would have failed the physical because he was malnourished and underweight. He trained with the 45th Division. He immediately started cartooning for the 45th Division and was sent overseas with them finally in 1943 to North Africa, then for the Sicily invasion, was discovered by the great Ernie Pyle, who wrote this article on Mauldin in January 1944. And that was it. I mean, Mauldin was then plucked from his division newspaper, put on Stars and Stripes, which had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world at the time. And he became an instant celebrity, most popular enlisted man in the United States Army during World War II. When he came home from war, Willie was on the cover of Time magazine. He had a best-selling book. He sold the movie rights to the book for more money than anybody had ever sold a book deal for before. He was on top of the world, and so, of course, his life fell apart. He divorced a wife he hardly knew. He welcomed a son he had never met before. Anybody who continued to read Mauldin's cartoons after he came home for the war in 1945 could see that there was problem in the marriage. Her husband spent months shopping for nice things in Europe. Willie, you never did that for me. Or this one. Come in, Joe. I'm being rehabilitated. This was a tumultuous time in his life and a tumultuous marriage, not only because, like Bill was, he had joined the Army at age 18. He had come home at age 23. He had been a pauper and now was a millionaire. And he had no idea how to live as a civilian. He had no idea how to live as a married man.
I think there was some guilt as well. Because
gosh, total
we're gonna have speakers on from the 45th Infantry Museum later in the Salerno series, and they'll be talking about the division's experience. And tough time doesn't cut it, and as you say there, he was with the division, but he knew what they were exposed to. He lived at the front line, but he was able to be plucked out of it and see a better type of life. And that's, survivor's guilt would have been there anyway, but survivors and not quite there with his mates guilt.
Yeah, that's it. You got it, Paul. It is more than survivor's guilt. It is more than survivor's guilt, because survivor's guilt is, random bullets fly, people around me die, but I'm not hit.
But you were in the race, so you could have been last or first. But
that's it.
If you're smoozing with Stars and Stripes reporters 20 miles behind the lines because you've been earmarked for that, you're not. You have no chance. Well, you have a minor chance of being hit by a strain, but you're not going to get in the same dangers as your buddies.
Mauldin was always candid about the fact that he deliberately worked very hard to get cartoons out in 1943 because he knew that if he didn't, he would be put on the line as a rifleman, and he did not want that. So he connived to get out of frontline duty. And that haunted him the rest of his life. And then not only that, his cartoons got better the more the 45th Division suffered. The harder the life was up front, the better his cartoons became. It's bizarre. The worse the war got, the better his cartoons get. And the more popular he becomes and the more money he makes. It's like this vicious cycle. He's being rewarded almost for the suffering of his brothers on the front lines. And that was something that was so hard for him to live with.
Do you mind if we go back to basics? Because a couple of people have been asking about Willie and Joe. We're talking about Bill, but his creations, it's like they were more famous at the beginning than he was, and then he became famous for creating them. So Terry is asking a typical question to pick up in the sidebar: are the cartoons generalities or of specific people?
Wonderful question. They're generalities. Willie and Joe are two random GIs. They're infantrymen. They are, they're supposed to be every man. Joe is maybe a little younger and unmarried. Willie is older and maybe married, and a little bit wiser. Joe has a little bit more of a temper. Willie, but so they're buddies. They're buddies, but they're meant to represent every man in the in the foxholes of Europe. They were the kind of typical frontline GIs. Mauldin comes home from the war and he notices things like unbelievable injustices in civil rights. So here is on the right, you see a wounded member of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Nisei Japanese American soldiers who served in Italy and elsewhere, goes into a bar. Bartender says, "We won't serve you here. Can't you read signs?" Mauldin starts doing cartoons like this and like this about the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and his syndicate, United Feature Syndicate, absolutely is telling him, don't do political stuff. Don't do this controversial stuff about the KKK, about racism, about discrimination, about civil rights violations. We don't want it. We want funny cartoons. And he gets into a big fight with the syndicate and he quits cartooning. He acts in Hollywood. He was in the Red Badge of Courage with Audie Murphy, another veteran of the Italian campaign. He wrote for Hollywood. He went to Korea, wrote a book about his time in Korea. He became a very accomplished airplane pilot and loved to write about airplanes, and he did. He ran for Congress and lost. He swore he would never cartoon again, and for 10 years he did stay away from it until he got back into it as a political cartoonist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You can see completely different style, completely different approach, much more spare and doing caricatures. President Eisenhower here on the left, Richard Nixon here on the right. And he wins a second Pulitzer Prize with his political cartoons. This is one that he does about Boris Pasternak being banned from going to the Nobel Prize for Literature Award in Oslo. He does civil rights cartoons, and he becomes kind of along with Herb Bloch, really the dean of American political cartooning in the 1950s and 1960s, with cartoons like this, hard-hitting cartoons about Vietnam and war and politics. He becomes very well known. He has a whole second career. There are a whole generation of people, baby boomers, who know Mauldin from these cartoons rather than from his World War II cartoons.
Well, I suppose, obviously he ran on the Democratic ticket, so that immediately means theoretically he's alienating half of the population of the US at any one time. But he would have had that respect from the working man, the fighting man, that I suppose even if you didn't agree with his all of his politics, that even if it was begrudging, he was one of them. He was true. He'd done his bit for his country, albeit he didn't want to run around with an M1, but he was able to use his specific skills to do far more for the war effort than he would have done if he'd been a slightly gangly, ill health infantryman. His work in, as you said there, it's the paradox of motivating people by pointing out how shit things are, but somehow reinforcing the togetherness of what these wise men. It is miserable. We're all in it together. Grief generally is a very uniting thing, isn't it? A family that's been at each other's throats and arguing, when someone dies, they tend to come together over those things. So that shared experience of the mud and the blood of Italy would have given him some kind of kudos and reputation. But did people turn against him who had previously been supporters?
They disagreed with him, certainly, but he seemed to enjoy the right to say what he wanted because of what he had done in World War II. He really did have a kind of a license that I think others did not enjoy. And that bond that you mentioned of infantry, it begins even before you go to war. It begins in training. And this is a typical cartoon that Mauldin did in the time before he went overseas into combat. He was reflecting the infantry's life back to them. This is the early iterations of Willie and Joe, the 45th Division, very interesting division, probably the most ethnically diverse that we had in the segregated army in World War II. A lot of Choctaw Indians, a lot of Mexican Americans were in that division. Bill was one of the few Anglo members of his rifle company. And he was doing cartoons like this about the mud and about the, marching and mean drill sergeants, and like all that, the kind of misery of infantry life. And he admitted that when Pearl Harbor happened, and the U.S. entered World War II, he was happy. He said, I was such a little shit. That's how he put it. That he said, all I thought about was my career. And I thought, like, hey, I'm going to be discovered. I'm going to become a famous cartoonist because, Lowell Abner is going into the Army. Everybody's going into the Army. And here is this guy who has great credibility with the infantry, who is well known, the most popular man in the 45th Infantry Division as a cartoonist. And so he peddles his stuff around to New York City publishers, and all he gets are rejections. And he wondered why, he would learn why. And that was because there really wasn't much of a role for infantry in this war, according to the projections of the War Department and the media.
Very good point.
Yeah. The infantry was not going to figure much in this war. It was, when I started working on the book, I tried to compare Mauldin's images of the infantry with other images of the infantry that were out there. And it was an easy comparison because there were no other images. I mean, it's stunning how the Army infantry is not represented in movies, in posters, in 1941, 42, 43. At the end of 43, there's this change. A lot of it comes from Mauldin. And in 44, they start getting represented more. But, you get tons of these Army Air Corps. No kid grew up wanting to join the infantry. They all wanted to be flyers, or Marines. Marines have J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency doing a lot of publicity for them. So there's a lot of publicity about the role of the Marines in the war. A lot of publicity about these elite units like the airborne, new elite units, paratroopers.
Even go back to that parachute image in a minute, because that is, if you don't mind, that is exactly what war is not like. that is completely a false representation to entice people to go down there. And we all, people know me. I knew some of the Easy Company guys. That's what made them go up. They'd volunteered for paratroopers because they thought it was cool and sexy, and above all, the $50 a month extra they would get in jump pay. and they're not wearing any gear. They've not got backpacks. They're not laden down with everything. All they're doing is standing heroically, very far apart legs there. That's very macho. That's with a Tommy gun.
Yeah, I love it.
Great and inspiring. But when you look at it now, it's ridiculous. Really.
Yeah. You've talked to the same airborne guys I have, because I've heard all those things too.
Yeah.
Exactly. The $50 a month, especially. Seabees, Naval Construction Battalions, they get their own movie. John Wayne and the Fighting Seabees. All of these special units, all of these elite units, all of these, people who are going to be kind of leading the way in the war. Even Merchant Marine, gets Humphrey Bogart action in the North Atlantic. Infantry gets nothing, really, until Mauldin. Mauldin finally, when the infantry starts getting represented, this is how they're represented. I've got a hangover. Does it show? This is just so different from anything. And this came about because of the Italian campaign.
Yeah.
That, it was in the Italian campaign that I think the War Department realized that their neglect of the infantry was causing a great cost, coming at a great cost. That the only way that Italy was going to be taken was going to be one, boot step at a time, and we were going to need thousands and thousands of more infantrymen than ever anticipated. The war would not be won from 30,000 feet. It would not be won with long-range artillery or small units of elite soldiers and then infantry using to police up the backwash. This is going to be a long, difficult slog with infantry leading the way. So there's a new need to promote and publicize the role of infantry. But the problem is there aren't any images of infantry. There's no, what you have is this. All the Army had was Mauldin, who is already popular within the infantry. Infantrymen loved this kind of thing because it emphasized not the heroism, not the valor, not the guts, as the paratrooper poster said, but the endurance, the grim endurance, the stalwart, ability to kind of endure the unadorable. No thanks, Willie. I'll go look for some mud that ain't been used.
I mean, that's one of my favorites. And again, there's never any sense in the Willie and Joe cartoons of them shirking their duty or
Right.
running away or cowardice. They're always in the fight. Yeah, they're sure they're bitching about it, and sure they wish they had clean socks, but there's no question of their, I don't want to use the word valor, but commitment. They're committed to it. It's every soldier's right to grumble, as is the old saying. And there's a couple of soldiers watchers now who would agree. It is your right. So there's a stoicism and a kind of a hidden heroism about it.
Yes.
Which brings me to the question, and we're just loving what you're saying. We've got a question from Peter O'Connell there. Given the Stars and Stripes assignment, were there any censorship barriers, or did cartoons get a pass?
No, tons of censorship barriers. Absolutely. Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. You know, there was a line, and it was not well defined. It was a gray line that you couldn't cross. Mauldin never crossed it. I don't know how, as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, 23-year-old, he knew how far he could push it, but he did push it as far as he could, but he never went over the line. In other words, he never showed people deserting. He never showed people crying or shaking. He never showed the worst of, combat stress reaction. Yeah, and he never showed body parts. He never showed the real physical, the most dramatic traumas of war. He knew, but it was always implied. It was always
exactly.
Implied.
I was going to say, it's implied though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's always implied.
It's that what you're not seeing in these cartoons, which maybe is why, because the people who might be worried about him getting near to crossing the line, maybe if they look at the cartoons, if you were a pencil pushing general somewhere on the general staff, maybe you didn't see the implications behind it. Maybe you didn't even look at the cartoons in the first place because it was below you, But I think if you were an infantryman in the New Zealand division or Canadian or anyone, I think you knew what was implied by these guys. You knew this. You could understand the subtext.
You knew exactly, and there's subtext in all of this. Here's a cartoon that just takes one little indignity of war that nobody on the home front would have ever thought of. I certainly never thought of this, that when you're living in a foxhole and you have to relieve yourself, you've got a choice. You either go in your foxhole or you expose yourself to deadly fire. Wish to hell I wasn't housebroke, says Joe, climbing out of his foxhole, or like this one. He's right, Joe. When we ain't fighting, we should act like soldiers. In the sense that this difference between those in the rear echelon and those who are actually doing the dying on the front lines. Here's another one that has a great story behind it. Them buttons was shot off when I took this town, sir. This almost got Mauldin thrown in jail. There was Arthur Wilson. General Arthur Wilson was the commander of the Peninsular Base Section in Naples, and Wilson liked to run a very tight ship. And he liked his streets to be cleaned, and he didn't like that every once in a while these combat soldiers looking like Willie and Joe were coming down from the mountains on a 4-day leave because they had such bad combat stress reaction. They couldn't fire their weapon, or they didn't know who they were, or they were losing it. And so they were relieved from front lines for 4 days. It would come down. You can imagine what these guys look like. They're beards and dirty and maybe bloody and staggering, and the order of the day, because Arthur Wilson ordered it, was for these men to be arrested for being out of uniform or being unshaven, and they would be put in jail for 4 days, given a bath, given a shave, given 3 meals a day, and they would be sent back up to the mountains after 4 days. And this enraged Mauldin, and he did this cartoon as a comment on that. And when Arthur Wilson saw this, he said, I want this cartoonist jailed for subversion. And the only way that he was saved was because a more powerful general, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., intervened and said, no, you're not touching Mauldin. Mauldin he's saying what needs to be said about what's happening to the combat soldiers in the Peninsular Base Section. And it wasn't the last time that Mauldin would be saved by a more powerful general, but the book came out, I got an email from a guy who said, I read your Mauldin book, and I just want to let you know that Arthur Wilson was my uncle.
Mm.
Yeah. And I said, uh-oh. And he said, you should know that Uncle Arthur was no more popular in my family than he was in the army. So, um, it was a grim life that Mauldin was depicting, and a short one that Mauldin was depicting. I'm beginning to feel like a fugitive from the law of averages. It really was just a matter of time before you were hit or damaged psychologically or killed. I mean, it was inevitable that, it was called combat fatigue, battle fatigue. You couldn't talk about it. The great Ernie Pyle tried to write about it several times. Each time he was censored. I know that Mauldin wished he could have cartooned more about it than he did here. I think that's the subtext here.
Yeah, clearly.
I think he should try to lie at attention. There's, Willie looking straight ahead with a blank look on his face. Alcohol, the British got a liquor ration, the Germans got a liquor ration, the Americans did not. So they had to make it themselves, or they had to scrounge it themselves. Hell of a way to waste time. Does it work? Love it. Them rats, them dirty, sore-headed, stinking Huns, them atrocity-committing skunks. The Germans knew that, by the way, about the Americans. They knew that Americans were desperate for alcohol. So when they would evacuate an Italian village, they would go, the last thing to do is go into the wine cellars and destroy all the vermouth and all the wine. And then they would leave the town. And the Americans would come in. This is the first place they'd go. And they would see this atrocity before their eyes. And
these it's reminding me, because so many of the people who watch this channel, they're historians in their own right. Brad is watching, others watching. Is that as a historian, you're learning about the war. You're learning the detail that isn't going to be found necessarily in war diaries and after action reports. The soldier observed details of a campaign that give us a wider view of those events and those campaigns than just reading sometimes rather stuffy war diaries and accounts there. And I can tell. I know you've done this presentation lots of times before, but you're having as much joy revisiting these cartoons for the however many times you've done it as I am looking at them. I've seen them obviously a fewer times than you have, but it's like you're like listening to your favorite song. It never gets bored. You must be kind of singing along the jokes. The subtext, the story, and yet they're brilliant. They're just brilliant. There aren't enough superlatives to describe these cartoons,
Paul, and there's not enough superlatives to describe the experience that I had when the book came out of doing a slideshow like this of Mauldin's cartoons in a room full of infantry World War II veterans. Yeah. Absolutely. The 87th Infantry Division Reunion Association. I had a presentation to them, and I will never forget it. The most raucous, uproarious laughter at every single cartoon, followed with guys that would like stand up and say, "That happened to me. I did that. I saw that." Each cartoon seemed to trigger a memory.
Yeah.
And it was just exhilarating for me to, in a sense, meet the real Willies and Joes, and hear their stories and feel the connection that they had with them.
And they work because he's not trying too hard. I mean, he obviously is putting a huge amount of natural talent into this, but he's not trying to come up with some kind of Shakespearean Oscar Wilde-like kind of inspired language pun. I mean, he's deliberately putting the language in slang. I mean, it reminds me, and you've mentioned Ernie Pyle. I mean, Ernie Pyle's writing is as good today as it was in World War II because he wasn't trying too hard. Ernest Hemingway, for example, writing in 44, was trying too hard, I think, to be the tortured literary genius, and wasn't hitting his earlier heights. He's like, "You're trying too hard now, Ernest." It's like the difficult third album, that the critics didn't like and the public didn't like it either. That's how I feel where Hemingway kind of is in the middle of the war, Whereas Pyle is just, it's based on observation, and it's based on just trying to convey what he's seeing in Pyle's way in a literary form, but in Bill's way in a cartoon. It's just, what am I seeing? This is it. Where's the joke here? And it's ironic. It's sarcastic humor. It's not boom 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 joke. It's sarcastic.
Yeah, and Mauldin said, Mauldin would say that he had it much easier than Pyle because he was only trying to hit with infantrymen. He said, "I was cartooning for the infantry. I was not cartooning for the folks back home. I didn't care if they got it. I didn't care if they understood it, if they thought it was funny. He said, the only thing I cared about is that infantrymen appreciated it. And he was reflecting their lives back to them because so few people were. And so it took people like me and folks back home in 1944, 1945, when they're seeing a cartoon like this, like, I don't get it. What's the gag here? And in other words, you have to think, you have to learn. It's an education. Mauldin's giving you an education if you're willing to pick it up and learn a little bit about it, Look at this. This is the one that the Pulitzer Committee singled out as representing why Mauldin deserved the Pulitzer Prize in 1945. Fresh-spirited troops flushed with victory are bringing in thousands of hungry, ragged, battle-weary prisoners. News item. And you can see this is Joe walking down a muddy street with a German POW. It's hard to tell who the Germans are from who the Americans are. All of them, as you said, are sharing in the same miserable weather.
Which is almost portraying the Germans in a sympathetic light.
That's it. Paul, how did he get away with this?
Exactly. This is the same era, and we've covered atrocities, and we're talking about an atrocity committed by the Italians, Germans against Italians, in a few days' time. In 1943, in this part of the world. The Germans could get up some very nasty things, and yet at the core, the infantry, who are not concerned with the politics, they're not concerned with the ideology. Most of them are excelling in the same experience. And folks, the caveat: I am not condoning or defending the actions of the SS. I'm showing that the German infantry in that photo there are just as miserable as the American infantry, as would be the Kiwis and the Canadians. Yeah, it's such vision and such insight and so revealing that.
And Mauldin depicted the Germans sympathetically. The ordinary, as you say, German infantry, not the SS, not the hierarchy, not Nazis, but the ordinary grunt, the German grunt, he saw as a brother in arm. And but the question is, how did he get away with this? And this was the question that really drove a lot of my research and writing of the biography. And I really found the answer, and that was that in a change, an official change at the War Department level, in the publicity campaign that the War Department was pursuing to promote the war, that from the early years of the War Department wanted to emphasize only the good news. We were winning every battle. The enemy was cutting and running. Morale was high. Everything was supply was good. Everything was going well. In mid-1943, polls were showing that Americans were believing the propaganda, and they were expecting the war to be over in Europe.
Yeah.
Christmas 1943. And Franklin Roosevelt and other office holders knew that if there was a letdown in those expectations, there would be a political price to pay. And the War Department and people are starting to grumble. What if we're winning every battle? Why is my son still overseas? Yeah. Why are we still having wage and price restrictions? Why are we having rationing? There was a lot of discontent on the home front with how the war was going, and if it's going on too long. And so the War Department decided that there had to be a change. They had to sober the American people up, and they had to come clean with them to a certain degree and liberalize the censorship to emphasize that it's a long, difficult slog, that the enemy is lethal, and that there are, as this picture depicts, people serving overseas that are sacrificing far more than you are at home here.
It's we've talked about it a lot. This 43 is an interesting era because the production is cranking up. You're churning out navigators for B-17s and pilots for B-24s. The programmers of training officers are cranking up. Same for the other countries as well. There is a peak that is going to follow this. Yes. The carriers are going into the line. The better aircraft are going in the line. The better tanks, things like that. The corners have been turned, and Stalingrad and Operation Torch, things like that. And yet, we've got to get over this hump until we can really reap the benefits of that, and it's not going to be quite yet. And people would agree, disagree. In watching this, is 43 a year where we're winning, or is it a year where we're still losing? Is it a year where we're drawing? All of those things apply. I think yes, and yes is my answer to all those. We're sort of doing, but we've got to just kind of catch our breath and just get over this difficult bit until we can bring the big war that James Holland, for example, talks about to bear, which we kind of do by 44. But 43, we're still at small to medium war with a big war coming behind us. And the public, as you say, there was a great talk this last weekend, Jonathan Fennell, about the protests among some of the British Army divisions, the 50th Division, been through North Africans, why us again? Like you're saying, why us again? Why can we done our bit? Why? He was writing letters and 43 is a tricky period to get through,
Tricky.
Because you can't, the governments can't reveal everything that the aces they've got up their sleeves that are coming. They can't let them be known yet. We can't say we've got a factory here making this because you don't want anyone to know that. So it's the information and how information is shared is really interesting.
And there was a decision by the Office of War Information to share this picture in September 1943. This photograph that appeared in Life magazine was the first depiction of dead American soldiers ever in the media. And it hit the country like a percussion grenade. And I've talked with several people who are kids on the home front, women who are living on the home front, who remember this coming out and just being their jaws dropping. It was sobering. And that was the idea, to kind of sober the American people up, to give them a sense of a harder, more difficult slog. And man, if it was the grimness of war that the War Department wanted, Mauldin's cartoons were perfect because they took you right up to that line where you could show the difficulties and the discomforts and the indignities and the endurance that it was going to take to win the war, but without showing the graphic horror of war. So grim side of war, that was it. Grim side of war. You could see, even in the promotions here of Mauldin's book, the mud, that sense of slog, that sense of the heavy grind of the infantry. And so the word was passed. Don't mess with Mauldin. I mean, it really came down from George Marshall. And from the highest levels of the War Department, absolutely.
Which brings us to the point we were saying right at the top of the show of just how difficult it is in 2023 to realize how much influence he had. He is being talked about at the lowest of level in that GIs are literally passing copies of newspapers while they're having a shit to each other, and yet he's being talked about in the highest echelons. That when you get that kind of reach, you kind of made it.
Yeah. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was a fan, and your anonymous, GI slogging it out in Italy was a fan. Absolutely. One guy who was not a fan was this man.
Yeah.
Who hated Mauldin from the time he saw the cartoons on Sicily in the 45th Infantry Division News. He went to the commander of the 45th Division, Troy Middleton, and he said, "I don't like this cartoonist. Get him out of the paper." And Middleton said, "I can't get rid of Mauldin. I mean, he's the most popular man in the division. No." And Patton said, "Absolutely, this is an order. These guys are unslovenly." I think at first Patton just thought that they were, they looked bad. They were, Patton was a spit and polish kind of general. And Middleton had the presence of mind to say, "Put it in writing, George." And Patton never got around to putting it in writing because, as you know, he was soon embroiled in a controversy, were extracted from the theater.
Bigger things to face. Yeah.
Right. And he was and sent to London. And it would only be later then that Mauldin would run up against Patton one more time. And this was in early 1945. Mauldin had decided to leave Italy for the first time. And he said he wanted to get to cover the Battle of the Bulge. And he went to France and took his Jeep to France and never got to the Battle of the Bulge. I think he actually didn't want to get there. I think he didn't want to get caught up in it. But what he did want to do certainly was go to Paris. And he drives his Jeep dressed like this to Paris. And his Jeep was tricked out. I mean, he modified the Jeep. He put red Lancia bucket seats in his Jeep. And he had, Willie and Joe license plates on the front and back. I mean, it did not look like an ordinary Jeep. And so he was pulled over, and the MPs went to arrest him. He tried to explain that he was the great Bill Mauldin. And they looked him straight in the eye and said, "We've never heard of you." And it was because he had done so many anti-MP cartoons. Mauldin didn't like MPs.
Yeah, of course.
So,
yeah.
They were getting back at him. He convinces them to take him to the Paris office of Stars and Stripes, which they do. He arrives there at the office, and they're in the middle of a meeting about Bill Mauldin's cartoons because they have a lot of complaints coming in. General John Lee doesn't like Mauldin's satirizing this bad supply situation. Charles de Gaulle wrote a letter complaining about Mauldin's depictions of the Free French. And then Patton writes this 3-page single-spaced letter just raging about how if Mauldin's cartoons aren't gotten rid of in Stars and Stripes, that Patton is going to stop distributing Stars and Stripes to the entire Third Army. And so the solution becomes to send Mauldin, and this comes from Ike personally. Eisenhower intervened, and through his aide Harry Butcher, he sent the message that Mauldin was to drive to Luxembourg and have a no-rank, man-to-man, face-to-face meeting with George Patton. And so Mauldin said, "Oh my gosh, this is unreal." Gets in his Jeep, drives to Luxembourg, is arrested, approaching Patton's headquarters, tries to explain that he's, this cartoonist who has a meeting on Ike's orders, gets let through. It finally, it checks out. And Mauldin, from memory, drew this image. He said he remembered it was like a palace where Patton had his office. And he said, "I remember being, completely in the best uniform I ever wore, a shiny helmet." He walks in, and he said these great oak doors opened, and what looked like a football field's worth of Baroque carpeting, he said, separated the door from the desk. And behind the desk was a tiny man. And then next to the desk was a chair and you could barely see it here in the image, with Patton's beloved bull terrier, Willie. And Mauldin said, I stared into the room and looked in the 4 meanest eyes I'd ever seen. He strides across the carpet, snaps his sharpest salute. Patton tells him to sit. And then Patton begins to lecture Mauldin on his cartoons. He said, "Your cartoons cause subversion. They cause insubordination. The Krauts ought to pin a goddamn medal on you for what you're doing for them." And Mauldin said that, and he said, and it was about a 40-minute lecture. And Mauldin said it was brilliant. The guy was obviously a genius, a rhetorical genius, and he knew his history. And he said he was making a pretty darn good case against me. And he said, and I was enjoying it until Patton opened a drawer in the desk, and Mauldin could see that in that drawer was a stack of clippings of his cartoons. And that's when Mauldin realized, I'm in trouble. This guy's obsessed. And this is the first one that Patton peeled off. And he said he held it and dangled it in front of my nose like it was contaminated, and said, "What the hell are you trying to do with this cartoon except cause insubordination?" And he had a good point. I mean, this is here's a commanding officer riding in a Jeep, and the Willie and Joe are pelting him with rotten tomatoes. My sir, what an enthusiastic welcome. And Mauldin tried to explain that one away. And then Patton held this one up, and he was confused. He said, "What the heck? So there was no caption with this. I don't get the joke. What is this?" And Mauldin said, "Sir, it's just that there's no caption to it. It's a stage show, and you see the men lined up to go into the stage show, and then you see the officers lined up to the right, to the back stage door, and they have candy and flowers, and they're there to date the stage girls. It's just to show the different levels of access that officers and enlisted have." And Mauldin said something remarkable happened, that Patton, who was wearing a scowl, managed half a smile. He said it was incredible muscular feat, considering the distance the corner of his mouth had to travel up his face, and he clearly got it. And then he gave Mauldin 2 minutes to rebut, and Mauldin said, "Sir, I think that my cartoons are good for morale, that the life of the soldier up front is so grim and so hard and so short in many cases that anytime these men can see their grievances aired, they feel better about their lot in life. And Patton kind of dismissed him and ordered him to go out and be a good soldier. Mauldin went back to his Jeep. Waiting in the Jeep was Will Lang, who was the senior war correspondent for Time Life. And it's just amazing to me that Mauldin connived to get the last word with Patton, and here's how he did it. Will Lang said, Bill, can I have an exclusive, from you about your meeting with Patton? And Bill said, yeah, he gave his point of view. I gave mine. We didn't change each other's minds, but we parted friends. This is a three-striped sergeant saying this about George Patton. And when Patton heard that quote, saw that quote in the next issue of Time magazine, that's when he said, if that little bastard comes into my Third Army again, I'll throw his ass in jail. The other thing that Mauldin managed to do was to arrange to have this cartoon published the day after his meeting with Patton on February 27th, 1945. This is Willie and Joe driving into Third Army, and they come upon the sign, you are entering the Third Army, fines, no helmet, $25, no shave, $10, no buttons, $10, no tie, $25, no shine, $12.50, no shampoo, $25, windshields up, $25, trousers down, $50, enforced by order of Old Blood and Guts. This is lampooning all the rules that Patton has imposed. Willie says to Joe, radio the old man will be late on account of a 1,000-mile detour. They're going to drive around Third Army so that they're not arrested. This is the kind of guy Bill Mauldin was. That's what made him irresistible to me as a subject of a biography.
Absolutely. And that is your last slide, and we've got a few more things to say. And that, just to go back to the insubordination accusation by General Patton, if I was a GI or a Tommy in Italy, a cartoon's not going to turn me over the edge. Seeing something actually happen. We all know of cases of, officers, kind of running away from the front or shortfall shells landing on their own positions, friendly fire. There's genuine, real things happening on a day-to-day basis that would possibly turn these men over the edge to insubordination. And yet, as we know, the cases of anything regards kind of mutinies are very, very thin on the ground in World War II. People grumbled, they bitched, and there was obviously mental anguish and PTSD. But you know what? They mostly just got on with it because that's the job, that's the deal. So, I can't see a GI who's just, or a Tommy who's just fought their way up the Gothic line, whatever he's going to be, the final straw is that cartoon he's singing. That's not it. Yeah. It's going to be a real event that's going to turn you over the edge. But one absolutely stunning insight into Bill's work and anything else you want to add as we are in Italy week about little things, snippets about what influence he may have had. You said, with the bad news he was sharing about the Italian campaign. Any kind of other insight, things you think you may have that come to mind?
Well, yeah. I mean, how clueless the folks back home really were about war. How clueless I was about war. I think I understood generally that, war is dangerous. Serving in the army is hard. But I didn't know that it entailed, basic indignities and discomforts all the time. You're too hot, you're too cold, you're too wet, you're too dry. It's always, you're sleeping outside. I mean, it's always tough. The other thing that I think I missed in the biography, and I would write it differently today if I were to write it again, is one thing I didn't get about Mauldin was he bitched and moaned about the army constantly, always, his whole life. On the other hand, he loved the army. And I couldn't quite square that. And it's because I never served. I'm not a veteran. I didn't totally understand the relationship. With the Veterans Breakfast Club, where we get veterans to share their stories, I started to understand that connection to the military that you have. And somebody explained it, one of the vets explained it to me, he said, it's like a family. You don't love everybody. You don't like everybody in your family, do you? Or they don't always make you happy, but they're your family, and they'll always be your family. Your brother will always be your brother, and you'll fight, and but he's always your brother, and that's how we feel about the military. And that absolutely was Mauldin. The army was his family in a really profound way.
No, I think that's the insight. It kind of brings you to David Kay is asking Todd, how has this experience changed you? And I think you've part answered it, but I'll let you answer it more. But it's that ability with what you do with the Veterans Breakfast Club, and I haven't served. You know, I've met lots of veterans. Is that the experience of the soldier? They don't often share it with you, because it's awkward talking about it. They don't want to, confess things, but it comes back to the fact that these cartoons, which are universal, most of these cartoons would equally have worked with two GIs in Afghanistan, or two British soldiers in the Falklands, or two soldiers of any army in any infantrymen, specifically infantrymen, of course. In any, that they're timeless. The bad weather is still bad weather. Those watching this who served their military, wet weather gear is still probably about as crap as it's always been. You always get wet. Nothing has got perfect anymore. So, but to expand on that, has it kind of given you, life lessons and lessons in how to deal with veterans?
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh, not only, I mean, yeah, it gave me life lessons how to deal with veterans, but also it encouraged me. It really was the starting point of me quitting my job to work with veterans full time. And I mean, the veterans community is so tight. It's so interesting. It's so diverse. They have so much to contribute. There's so much knowledge, experience, and wisdom in the veterans community. And my goal is to try to unlock some of that so that the rest of us could access it. I mean, they have perspectives on life that I think people who haven't served don't have. You can have it. Certainly you can gain it, but the military gives it to you, whether you like it or not.
Well, we've got comments that are typifying that now. Jeff is saying, I miss my time in the army, but I bitched all the time.
That's right.
And John is saying, you can only truly hate something you either love or loved. I think what a line that is. I've made a mistake in my past, made mistakes where I've tried to have joined in a group of veterans bitching about something. No, you can't bitch about this. You weren't there. You can laugh at us bitching, but and when I was half joining, they would take the defense immediately of the organization, stroke regiment, stroke so and so they've just been bitching about. Because I've crossed the line.
Also, so have I. I've crossed the line too. Yeah. That's it. I've criticized somebody's family, even though I'm not a member of it. I don't have the right to do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Which brings us back to this inherent ability you mentioned of knowing when not to cross the line. Again, it's not like he was some wizened showbiz stroke cartoonist professional who traveled the world for 20 years. He wasn't a Hemingway to bring him back into conversation. No. He's going over there as a driven, taking his model foot forward tee around a little bit, but he's about as young and greenhorn as you could possibly get. With no literary experience, no understanding of the publishing industry, no understanding of censorship, and yet he's able, with this innate ability, to just know, that's the line there. Nudge the line, hover 1 foot over the line, but just keep over this, as you said there, undefined line.
Yes.
That he, what incredible foresight and insight he had.
He had amazing powers of observation. And I think that's a lot of great artists have that. He would sit quietly and observe. I mean, his practice when he was doing his cartoons is he would spend a week or two on the front lines, just observing, living the life, and then go back and spend 2 weeks working on cartoons. And then he would have to go back. That's how Ernie Pyle worked also. And it takes incredible powers of observation. He had to be quiet a lot of the time and just kind of understand the system that was unfolding before him.
Yeah, no, well, I feel like I've made a kindred spirit. I'm now already thinking about what excuse I can have to invite you back again to talk about something else. It's just, I've just had a few days of break, and to come back with a surefire hit like this has been fantastic. And it's that angle I love to bring to this channel of the military story and the different types of field that my guests work in. And this insight to Bill has given us an insight in a much larger way on the Italian campaign and the life of the soldier. So I can only thank you again for coming on, and remind people, folks, that the link to the book is in the description below. You can also find the link to Todd's work with the Veterans Breakfast Club in the description below. And I encourage you to go out and follow that on social media and what have you, and see what they're up to, because you do a lot of things, and you're a good man, Charlie Brown, to bring to mix my cartoons up there, as is my right, because it's my show. So have you enjoyed chatting to me and my bunch of viewers?
This is great. This is great. I love talking with you, and I hope to be in contact with you again.
Yeah, I know we'll do it again. So, folks,
All
I'm
right.
back in tomorrow. Matthew Willis is talking about the A36, the variant of the Mustang that was dive bombing over the beaches of Salerno. So, from the ground and the mud to the air tomorrow. So, folks, this is Paul Bedard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, viewers. See you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Take care.